Okay, hello everybody. This is Lena Fenton, and I'm back with another free Q&A for today. Today is the 21st of April. Okay, so the first question, somebody wrote to me during the weekend, and the first question that I'm going to talk about is, and it says, could you make could you talk about difficulties in a relationship with different sex drives or sexless relationship where one partner has no interest in sex anymore? So that's basically going to be my focus. I've had another question as well from a different individual asking about difficulties in reaching climax. Now, I presume that that means that there has been some intercourse and climax is not achieved. But I'll come to that later. Let's first of all talk a little bit about differences in libido. This is a really broad subject, and I think it's very difficult in a sense to pinpoint something about it, because there are so many factors that would be taken into account if we were talking about, if I were talking to a couple or an individual. So where to start? I guess I thought that where I would start is with thinking about, first of all, whether the differences in libido have always been present or whether they have developed over time. What do I mean? So what I mean is, for instance, if you're somebody who has never really been that bothered about sex, maybe if you were left to your own devices, you would maybe have sex once a month or once every few months or whatever. And this is just your natural, normal rhythm. And you've always been like that. You've always had a relatively low sex drive, if you like. Then that's one thing. So that's lifelong. That's just a feature of your sexual behavior. It's your natural sex drive, if you like. On the other hand, you may be somebody who has always been interested in sex on a daily basis, or even several times a day. And I don't mean compulsively. I mean that you could happily have sex more than once a day. And that could be considered quite a high sex drive, I guess. Then those two extremes, if you come together, it's unlikely that you'd be compatible, to be honest, because one of you would be very unhappy very quickly. So, and those just before I move on from that, just those kinds of variations are very common. I know that we all know probably that the average is 2 or 3 times a week, certain in England, and perhaps in Western society. But the thing about averages is that it includes it's the mean between those extremes, from rare or no desire for sex to continuous desire for sex, and everything in between is what we then think of or talk about in terms of the average. But that average is reached because there are those extremes. So it is, what I'm trying to say is that it is natural and normal to have whatever level of sexual desire or libido you happen to have. So that's one thing. So that's the first basis with which I wanted to start this conversation. The next level, or the next problem, and I think the problem that this person is perhaps facing, is in that there's a relationship that maybe started in the normal way, where, for instance, there's a lot of attraction right at the beginning. There is a lot of sex right at the beginning. The first 6 months, generally, if people really like each other and get on well, generally the first 6 to 9 months, the sexual activity is all often, and I don't have any scientific data for this, but from my anecdotal data from my professional experience, what I've come to know is that people almost always have fairly frequent sex during that first 6 months to a year. Now, once things tend to then change when things become more secure and more settled. And sex may still continue to be, well balanced in the sense that you may want it mutually frequently. Over time, however, things can change. The dynamics of the relationship can change. Children may come along. Work stresses may occur. Family commitments may increase. And that all of that, I think, tends to change, therefore, the amount of energy that we have available for intimacy, sexual intimacy. And I think that what happens then is that also we become more and more familiar with our partner. And I think those forces, combined with perhaps a very busy lifestyle, all sorts of things come into play. And I think less and less and less we give time or prioritize our relationship or our partner. And sex becomes something that you might do on a Sunday morning when you've had at least a couple of nights good sleep. Or when the children are with the mother-in-law or your parents or whatever. It becomes less and less a priority on life because life just seems to take over and you tend to forget about it. I think that that's often when sexual drive, libido, changes in any case, sometimes for both partners, sometimes for one, sometimes for another. So already I'm saying to you, there are two different ways of thinking about this. First of all, is it lifelong? Has it always been that way? And second, is it something that has developed over time? And I think it's important to know the difference between those two, because something that is lifelong, probably you're not going to be able to do very much about, although some adjustments can be made, certainly. Something that is acquired over time in a relationship is something that can be addressed much more readily, let's say. So how would it be addressed? Again, it very much depends on the history, and this is why sometimes it's difficult to have these very broad questions, because so much depends on some detail. People stop having sex for all kinds of reasons, but I guess if a blanket explanation might be something like something is happening in the sexual encounter, something is happening in the relationship that means that the sexual intimacy becomes less and less pleasurable. It becomes more problematic, and eventually you want to avoid it altogether. Now, there's a whole range of reasons why that can happen. I think one of them can simply be boredom. I think the simplest explanation can be boredom. And part of my work with couples is often looking at what habitually they do sexually. Another can be a kind of a lack of emotional empathy. What do I mean by that? There is in my understanding, there is a lot of difference between men and women. And I think a lot of it is culturally based, and I think a lot of it can be changed. But initially, at least, when we're looking at a thing somewhat superficially, what we're thinking about is the idea that men tend to be more genitally based and a little bit more matter of fact about being sexual. Whereas perhaps women, and these are very broad generalizations, and I apologize for that, but it's really, you know, the easiest way to discuss these issues. Women, on the whole, tend to be more emotionally based with their sexuality. So for a woman, it's very often, and this has been proven by lots of different research, very often a woman needs to feel good about herself, good in herself. And that means, you know, she needs to feel attractive, she needs to feel rested, she needs to feel that she's in a good space, emotionally and mentally and physically. And then sex is possible. Whereas for a man, having sex puts him in a good place in himself. So it kind of works the opposite way around. And that's unfortunate, but it often happens that way. Now, what's interesting is that when it happens the other way, where a man needs to feel good in himself before he's able to function sexually, men tend to think about that as a kind of malfunction of some kind. Because often, and especially in our current society, men tend to think that they should be able to get an erection whenever. It shouldn't be predicated by their emotional state or their physiological state, or even their stress levels. In fact, for many men, you know, it's like, well, yeah, I'm stressed. That's why I want sex, because then I'll de-stress. Whereas when it occurs that even for a man, the level of stress is actually impeding his capacity to want sex, to feel desire, to get an erection, then that becomes a much more serious issue. Whereas for women, that's quite a common event. So going back to the idea about around sexual difficulties when there's a difference of libido, one of the first things you need to think about and you need to look at is to what extent, and I'm just going to use gender stereotypes, to what extent I as a man am I thinking about how well my woman feels and my partner feels in herself. And conversely, for a woman, I think she needs to be thinking about how much is the stress preventing him from being able to actually really get into that headspace where sex is possible. And talking about headspace, it's really interesting that to think about sex being somewhere that you go to in your head rather than something you do with your body. And I think that's another difference that needs to be thought about when we're talking about differences in libido, because once a human being's capacity to get into a kind of sexual state is based on his or her ability to go there in their heads. And often when there are too many emotional, physiological, and psychological stressors, it's much more difficult. So people will often say, for instance, and you may have heard your partner say it to you, or you may even have thought it yourself, I can't switch my head off. You know, I'm trying to have sex, but actually I'm thinking about, you know, I don't know, whether we're going to have enough money next week, or what the boss said to me the other day, or some other thing, because it's just difficult to switch that part of yourself off to the extent where you can let yourself go into the sexual experience. And that in itself can become a habitual way of being, so that the longer the lack of sexual activity goes on, the more difficult it is to get yourself to go into that headspace, into that mental way of being that enables you to become go into that sexual feeling. The thing is, you see, that it's your brain that's the biggest sexual organ, and this has been said many times by many people, I'm sure. But it's about how well you can get into your head and into that space in yourself where you can relax into the experience instead of trying to either control it or drive the experience in one way or another. Another way to think about how to bridge the gap between differences in libido is actually to try and think about how to slow things down. So this goes together with kind of trying to get into the right headspace. So what do I mean by that? I mean that instead of just going for the sexual act, sometimes it's really important to really slow things down and do something really relaxing and comforting, and perhaps non-sexual but sensuous, until such a point that both of you are relaxed and you can begin to go into that mental space. So I've said in previous recordings that one of the things that you can do is a kind of lying together, maybe after you've had a shower, you've set up some music, some candles, you've set a nice atmosphere in the room, and then you just lie stroking each other. Not sexually, just naked, but stroking each other. Obviously, the room has to be warm enough. And looking into each other's eyes and just trying to just be with each other, either, and you can talk, but I would suggest that initially maybe it needs to be a little bit silent in order to be able to just get into that, what your body's feeling and what you're experiencing, either by the caressing that you're doing or the caressing that's being done to you. And that kind of allowing yourself to just sink into the experience very gently can, if then become more erotic and more sexual. But it's a much slower, much gentler way of actually processing into sexuality. And I think that's really important, especially if you haven't had sex for quite a while, or especially if your partner feels that they're really not, there's no arousal for them. I think that kind of sensuous togetherness can actually awaken something else. So that's one technique. I'm also fond of a very old-fashioned saying, which is the family that plays together stay together. And I think that's true for couples. I think the couple that plays together stays together. So I think doing a fun activity that you enjoy, I think, produces enough of those feel-good chemicals, the cuddle hormones, as they're also known, that is more likely to allow you to then get more intimate later on. So whether it's kind of finding jokes that you can tell each other, whether it's your favorite board game, whether it's going for a long walk, somewhere like your nearest park, if you have somewhere like across, I know somebody who has a park across the road, going for a walk and just talking gently with each other, something that you both used to enjoy. Maybe if this is a long relationship, maybe something that you used to enjoy in the early days of your relationship, recapture some of those moments. Because the thing is, you see, that people often say to me, oh, well, it should be spontaneous, I shouldn't have to kind of set it up, so to speak. And I say to that, well, actually think about it. Your first date was a complete setup, because you planned the time, you planned the space, where you were going to go, you planned what you wore, you planned all sorts of things. Actually, you might even have planned, I don't know, putting a couple of Durexes or condoms in your pocket just in case. So these are all kind of, you projected into an evening or a day that you spent with your partner. Why wouldn't you do that now still? Why would you just take it for granted that because they're there, you can just have sex, full stop? Why would you not set it up so that you produce those feel-good chemicals in each other, in each other, and then lead on to more sexual behavior after that. So recapturing some of that initial magic, I think, is an important way to bridge that gap of desire. I mean, if there have been traumas in the relationship, either that you've experienced jointly, or if one of the partners is a survivor of some sort of trauma, sometimes those emotional things can also block the sex drive, and that would be something that you would need to see a qualified therapist such as myself to help you deal with. I'm trying to think of other reasons why there might be such an extreme difference in desire or lack of desire. One of the things that I've mentioned her before, Esther Perel is a worldwide sex therapist who's written a few books, and she does a lot of talks and stuff. And one of the books that she's written is called Mating in Captivity. And in that, the whole basis of that book is this idea that there is a conflict in a human being between security, emotional security in a relationship, and the need for newness and adventure and maybe a little bit of risk. Now, sexually, what is more exciting is the little bit of risk. Emotional security does not actually fire up the libido really at all. And you tend to end up in a situation where you're kind of living with somebody who feels more like a brother or a sister, or I don't know, a close cousin or something. But not somebody that you would fancy really, simply because you're too familiar, you're too secure, and there's no stimulus. It's all same. So you're a bit bored, to be honest. And that's difficult to say as well. And if your lover is not a particularly skilled lover, that can also be quite boring. So what Esther Perel recommends, and certainly what I recommend to the couples I work with, is that you start to look at what kinds of things might excite your interest. For instance, and I've said this before, one of the things that some couples do is they meet, they go out separately and they meet in a bar, and they'll pick each other up as if they'd never met before, and so play that kind of game with each other, and then possibly, if they can, go and spend the night in a hotel and so on. But sometimes even just a change of scenery, like going away for the weekend, can be really helpful, because it takes you out of that daily humdrum environment, which can be your home and the relationship, which is kind of, it dampens desire because you're just so safe, I guess, and you kind of know what's coming. It's kind of the not knowing that provides that little bit of excitement that can really raise the level of desire and libido. And yes, you might have to keep doing things like that, and you might have to keep finding different ways of exciting the relationship, with sex toys, or with sharing fantasies, or there's a whole range of things that you can do to renew desire, to restart your sex life. But I think then, if it's a case of boredom, then you're looking at really getting creative and talking honestly and openly about your feelings and about what you would like and what you don't like, and not taking it personally that somebody might not like you doing X, Y, Z, whatever it is, but rather listen and really try and hear what your partner is saying. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there for that question. I hope it's helped you to some extent. The other question that I was given also by somebody was about the difficulties in reaching climax. Now, that is actually quite a complex, again, it's quite a complex question, because it's there's again a whole host of reasons why that might happen. And the first thing, so if I had a client who came to me and said, you know, I can get an erection okay, or I can get turned on okay, I get lubricated, whatever, and I enjoy intercourse fine, it's not a problem, but I just never peak, I never reach that point of orgasm, or I kind of get really close and then I lose it somehow. One of the first things I would want to do is just make sure that everything mechanically is working. So I would have the individual be checked by a doctor in the first place, make sure there's nothing physically that might be wrong. For instance, somebody with diabetes can have difficulties in getting an erection and certainly get in climaxing because of the way it affects the cardiovascular system. So that might be an issue. Now, I keep talking about erection, and the thing you've got to realize is that women's clitorises are like mini penises, and they too get erect. And also the climax point in both men and women is the pelvic floor contractions. So the mechanism, although it looks slightly different, fundamentally is actually the same. So it can be quite similar for a man or a woman when with difficulties with climaxing. Now, women, of course, are much better and are very practiced at faking their orgasm, sadly. I think because it just makes life easier, women say to me, but actually, I think in the end, it produces a fake situation. And that can, I think that kind of level of dishonesty in during a sexual encounter can actually really reduce the level of, well, it obviously, there's a lack of authenticity, first of all, but also I think that whether you're conscious of it or not, I think men and women are able to feel the energy of the arousal energy and the changes, the physiological changes through in arousal and climax. And yes, you can fake it, but ultimately, I think that it doesn't have the same kind of potency when you fake an orgasm as having a real orgasm. And yes, I think women do it to satisfy men's egos. And again, I think that's a shame because it doesn't give a man opportunity to learn to be better or different. So be it. That's perhaps a conversation for a whole other time, another time. In terms of the male not being able to achieve climax, there are various things you can do. One of the things that I think helps climax is a good amount of lubrication. Although at times that can also kind of defeat the purpose because you need to increase the sensitivity. And sometimes it can be a kind of a lack of sensitivity, as in maybe sometimes if you've had lots of sex over a period of time, there can be a reduction of sensitivity in the genitals, and that can prevent the intensity of the sexual excitement from peaking. So it just kind of plateaus off. So some you could try, one of the things you can try is a period of abstinence even. So whether it is that you're masturbating a lot and then when you're having intercourse you're struggling to climax, or whether it's because you've had too much sex and your system is kind of a bit numb, a bit numbed out, then a period of abstinence would be a good idea. I know for some men, for instance, who have used too much Viagra, the penis can become unresponsive. So again, just kind of lay off everything for at least 2 to 3 days. Just really give yourself a complete detox, if you like. And then try again. Another technique that you can try is to masturbate to the point of ejaculation and then re-enter and see if that kind of restarts it. If it's a chronic problem, you really need to be thinking about um, your levels of desire and excitement. There may also be one of the reasons I said earlier about um, having yourself checked out physically is because there may be a testosterone level drop or change or something like that. So it's also about your health and really checking that you're in good physical condition. It may again be a similar problem to what I was speaking about earlier, which is about being able to go there mentally and being able to really kind of relax into it and not trying to control it. I think a lot of men try to have absolute control over their body, and sometimes it's actually about letting go of control and just going with the internal feeling of the experience. So allowing yourself to just be with what your body's telling you is another way to think about this and what you're doing. Stress is another one, of course. Again, because stress will kind of cause you to have, we talked earlier about lower libido, and of course, if your sex energy is low, then you may be able to get an erection, you may be able to have intercourse, but it may not be able to take you to the final stage. So, and the other one, of course, is again boredom. So very similar, very similar things that I've said about lack of libido, I think, apply to the inability or difficulties in reaching climax. You need to look at your health, you need to look at your stress levels, and you need to look at the level of safety in the relationship. And I mean that emotional safety and closeness. Something is not connecting up right, and that might need some more thinking about and some more investigations. Now, I haven't seen anyone else come on with any more questions, so unless you want to ask me something else, I see there are some people watching this currently. But of course, you're always very welcome to, if you're watching this at a later stage, you're very welcome to write to me and send me the questions. I'm here on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3:30 for about 30 minutes. If there's lots of questions, I can go on for longer, but around about 30 minutes. It's free. Let me know what your problems are, especially during this lockdown. Obviously, lots of people are having lots of wonderful sex, which I think is brilliant, and lots of people are finding that they're kind of having to face the difficulties that they've maybe been able to avoid by going out, socializing, working longer hours, and so on. Now is a time where you're really having to stop and look, and you're forced to face whatever difficult situations are in your home, and whatever they might be. Please feel free to contact me. My website is linafenton.com if you want to get my phone number and email address, or you can simply contact me via my YouTube channel. Okay, so Lina Fenton, lovely to speak to you again, and see you maybe on Thursday. Bye-bye.